All right, Shabbos, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the shir and drashos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents. Dina Bas Pesach and Zechariah ben Zechariah. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Akiva Noach and Karen Andrews, for dedicating the learning this week for the yahrzeit of Karen's mother, Marsha Bas David, and our Daf Yomi sponsors for this morning, Linda and Michael Elman, Li'iloi Nishmas, Bernice Rogoff Rubin, Basha Bas Binyamin. Good, okay. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, and the families in Necham. With that, let us begin. So we have an incredible daf ahead of us today. So we are picking up, today's daf is Tzadik Beis 92. So we are picking up in Mirz Hashem on Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis at the 2 dots. So we left off a little bit before the Mishnah at Tanu Rabbanon, right across from Tosas, Shema Yedaktiku. So it's a really incredible Gemara today. So it says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanon, Pesach Matzah Umarer Berishon Chova. So the Brisa says Pesach Matzah and Marer on the first, what we call Pesach Rishon, is obligatory. Mikan ve'ilach rishus, but from here on in it is optional. Says the Gemara. Well, what are we talking about? Rabbi Shimon Omer, ba'anoshim chova, ba'anoshim rishus. Rabbi Shimon says for men it's obligatory, for women it's optional. So ahi akai. We'll say, so what are we referring to over here? Ilei ma'a Pesach. If you want to say ultimately again that when Rabbi Shimon says for men it's obligatory, for women it's optional, it's referring to Pesach, Karban Pesach. So Pesach kol shiva mi'ika. So we'll say there's no such thing as Karban Pesach being obligatory all 7 days of Yom Tiv. Elo amatzah u'marer. Perhaps it's referring to matzah and marer. Here's the problem. Ema seifa, Rabbi Shimon Omer, ba'anoshim chova u'b'noshim rishus. When Rabbi Shimon says that for men it's obligatory, for women it's optional, so the Gemara says, Leslie, the Rabbi Shimon, Hadam Rabbi Elazar, Noshim chayavos b'achilas matzah, Devar Torah. Does Rabbi Shimon not subscribe to the idea? I will say, as much as we had a discussion in yesterday's daf regarding Karban Pesach, but everyone will agree that women are obligated for matzah. After all, the pasuk says, Shnei Amar, Lo sochal alav chametz, Shivas Yomim Tochal Alav Matzos. The pasuk says, you shall not eat chametz for 7 days, you shall eat matzah. Now the fact that we juxtapose the prohibition of chametz to the obligation of matzah teaches us a very important yesod. Kol sheyeshno bebal tochal chametz, yeshno bekum echol matzah. Whoever has a prohibition to consume chametz has an obligation to go ahead and consume matzah. V'hani noshim hol v'yeshno bebal tochal chametz, yeshnon bekum echol matzah. And these women, since they have a prohibition to go, since they are bound by the prohibition to consume or against consuming chametz, they have an obligation to consume matzah. So rather, what is the Brisa referring to? Ela ima Pesach matzah u'marer berishon chova mikan ve'ilech rishos. So rather, again, what the Brisa means to say is like this: Pesach matzah and marer are obligatory ultimately again on Pesach Rishon. Mikan ve'ilach already on the first day of Yom Tiv. Mikan ve'ilach rishus. But from there on in, it is a rishus. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Pesach ba'anoshim chova, b'noshim rishus. And Rabbi Shimon disagrees when it comes to Karban Pesach, and he will say that when it comes to Karban Pesach, halacha l'maisa, it's obligatory for women, but ultimately again, it is optional it is obligatory for men, but optional for women. Good. So I'll say that's the Brisa. So that closes out that particular sugya. It says the Mishnah. So now we're going to continue a little bit on the previous sugya as well, which was the notion of, well, let's see. So remember, we spoke about, in yesterday's daf, we saw the concept that someone who is unable to technically eat at the time of shechita, Rabbi Shor mentioned to me after the shir, remember when we speak about shechita, right, somebody who's fit or not fit, there's not shechita, really what we're looking for is zrika, right, because remember again, it's zrika which actually makes the carbon, but so when I say shechita, really in this context, we're referring to shechita / zrika. So halacha l'maisa, we're introduced to the concept that even someone who's not fit to go ahead and consume the carbon at the time of shechita / zrika, but will be fit that night, can be part of the chabura. So continuing a little bit along this theme, the Mishnah says as follows. The Mishnah says, Onein tovel va'ochel is pischol erev, avalo bekachim. So what's an interesting case here, an onein. So remember again, the onein is the individual who has lost one of the 7 relatives for whom he is obligated to mourn. So an onein goes to the mikvah. Now we'll say this is actually quite an interesting halacha. The midirabbanon, we say that an onein cannot partake of kachim and of Karban Pesach until he first goes to the mikvah. Now, remember, this is interesting because this is true even if he did not come in contact with the corpse. Right? Halacha l'maisa. Well, we'll see this in the Gemara. So, onein, tova va'ochel es pischol arav. So, an onein, so we'll say, remember again the context here. The onein is the individual who lost a relative. What we discussed already in yesterday's daf is that, technically speaking, and this is the opinion that the Mishnah is going by, aninos d'oraisa only applies for the day of death. That night, he's still an onein midrabanan. But what we're going to see is we suspend rabbinic aninus so as to allow him to partake of the Karban Pesach. However, before the onein can partake of the Karban Pesach, he must first go to the mikvah. Aval lo bekachim. But I will say this would not apply by kachim. So what this means is, for example, as follows: that halacha l'maisa, Ruvain loses his father on Erev Pesach. Okay, so now midda oraisa on Erev Pesach, that day he is an onein, which means he cannot partake of any kachim. That onein status really extends into the night as well. So which means at night he would not be permitted to eat other kachim. However, so we're going to see Chazal suspended rabbinic nighttime aninos in order to allow Ruvain to partake of Karban Pesach. We'll see that in the Gemara. But what the Mishnah is introducing us to is Ruvain cannot participate in the Karban Pesach until he first goes to the mikvah. So this is only a din by Karban Pesach, not by other kachim. Hashomea al meso, if somebody hears about a relative who died. Now, both say, Bepashtos, this is talking about what we call Ishmua Rechoka. So, halacha l'maisa, if a person hears about the death of a loved one of the 7 close relatives, right? A mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, spouse. If one hears about the death of a loved one, if you hear about it within 30 days, you have to observe Shiva. If you hear it after 30 days, essentially you only observe 1 day of mourning. So that's the case over here. Shomea al-meso, someone hears about the death of a loved one, but outside of 30 days, or is after 30 days of the death, or top of Tzadik Beis. V'hamalakit lo atzamas, or I both say likut atzamas. Likut atzamas means when a person would collect the remains of a loved one for reburial. So we'll say, for us this sounds a little bit strange, but remember, Bizman Mishnah, it was common that what you would do was as follows. You would go ahead and they had burial vaults. So, like, if you ever go in Yerushalayim, right outside of the grave of Shimon HaTzadik, there is what they called the kever of the Sanhedrin HaKatan. It was a burial vault. So what a burial vault was, you had a cave. The cave had slabs. They would put the body on the slabs. That's still considered to be like burial in the earth. They would wait till the body would decompose. They would collect the bones, and then they would bury the bones in a family plot. You have to understand something. Apparently, the issue of not having enough space for burial in Eretz Yisrael has always been an issue. You see this now, it's happening in Haram Menuchos. They're starting to build, buildings, underground vaults. So what they would do is they would collect bones, because obviously you need a lot less space to bury bones than you need to bury a body. So the day that you would collect the remains of a loved one, there would be like that day was a day of Avelos. So the Mishnah says over here, if you hear about the death of a loved one after 80 days, or the day in which you're collecting the remains of your loved one, these days counted as like a day of Aninos, a day of Avelos. So what's the halacha? Tova va'ochel bekachim. That night, you would go to the mikvah, and that night you would be permitted to partake of karbanos. Gershon is Sky Erev Pesach. Let's listen to this case. What happens if someone converts on Erev Pesach? So such a fascinating case. Right? You would tell the guy, just wait 7 days. Right? Just wait 7 days. Right? Life is much easier, right? But anyway, the ger wants to go ahead and convert Erev Pesach. So Beis Shammai omrim tova va'ochel es pischol Erev. So Beis Shammai says, no problem. He finishes his gerus on Erev Pesach. Tovel, we make him go to the mikveh, and he can eat Karban Pesach that night. Now both say, what I want to point out is when Beis Shammai says Tovel, that's not the tevilah for gerus. Right? Obviously, he already did his tefillah for Gerus. Beis Shammai is saying he does another tefillah, goes to the mikvah, and could eat Karban Pesach that night. So the Gemara says, however, Beis Hillel says, no, haporish mina arla, kiporish mina kever. Not true. That on the day, assuming that his bris milah happened that day on Erev Pesach, one who goes out and separates from his arla, which means one who undergoes a bris milah, it's as if literally he's had contact with a corpse, and halacha l'maisa, he actually has to wait like tumas meis 7 full days. So interestingly enough, according to Beis Shammai, a person who converts on Erev Pesach, he just needs to go to the mikvah. He can eat Karban Pesach that night. But according to Beis Hillel, a person who converts on Erev Pesach, in fact, can't partake of Karban Pesach that day, or that night for that matter. Will have to wait until next year, ultimately, to partake of Karban Pesach. So, or I shouldn't say that, or potentially Pesach Sheni, if he converted Erev Pesach. So let's analyze the cases. Says the Gemara. So let's go to the first case. First case was the Onain case, right? So remember again, just to clarify, Reuven loses his father on Erev Shabbos. So remember again, that day he is an Onain. Technically speaking, again, so the Mishnah said that all Reuven needs to do is that day he goes to the mikvah, and that night he could partake of Karban Pesach. My taima, what's the reason for this? Kasavra aninos dalayla dirabanon. Because the Tanakama of the Mishnah holds that nighttime aninos is dirabanon. In other words, mid'oraisa, the status of aninos is only the yom hamisa, only the day of death. Although midrabanon, we will perpetuate aninos up until kvura, that is only midrabanon. The Gemara says v'gabe Pesach lo ha'emidu divrei b'makom karis. However, by Karban Pesach, where failure to do so results in a din of kares, essentially the Rabbanon suspended their halacha. And the Rabbanon said, we will suspend aninos dalayla so as to allow the individual to offer up Karban Pesach. Gabi kodshim ha'emidu divreihem b'makom asay. However, again, Abu is saying, so when it comes to Karban Pesach where failure to do so results in kares, Chazal will suspend their aninos dirabanan. When it comes to other karbanos, where failure to consume it is only an asay, Chazal kept their aninos dirabanan intact. That's why halacha l'maisa, if on the night of Pesach the individual will be an onin midrabanan, Chazal suspended their aninos dirabanan, go to the mikvah, and you can go ahead and consume your Karban Pesach. Hashomea almei. So remember again, the next case was if someone hears about a loved one who died after 30 days. So that's pretty much the same case as aninos. What the Gemara is intrigued by is the case of Malaki Tatsamas. That if I go to collect the bones of a relative for reburial, so the Mishnah says no problem, just go to the mikvah and you can eat Karban Pesach that night. What are you talking about? Malaki Tatsamos, haboy hazosh lishu shvi. But say, if you gather bones, then you've contracted tumas meis. If you contract tumas meis, there's a 7-day purification process with sprinkling of the paraduma on days 3 and 7. So how can you just go to the mikvah and consume Karban Pesach that night? Rather, the Gemara says, Ema sheliktu lo atzamos. No. What it means is, I didn't gather the bones myself, but rather I had someone else do it. So we'll say, interestingly enough, if you are having the remains of one of the 7 close relatives gathered and reinterred, you have the status of an avos. It's almost like you have Shiva that day, the day of Likot Atzamas. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, whether aninos of the day or avelos of that day, all you need to do is go to the mikvah and ultimately can consume Karban Pesach that night. But say what is interesting to note over here is this notion of having to go to the mikvah in order to leave the status of aninos or avelos and to consume Karban Pesach that night. Good, that's a din d'Rabbanan that you have to go to the mikvah. Good, Gershin is Kayer. So we'll say now we come to the case of a person who converted. So remember, a person converts on Erev Pesach. So here we have a machlokes. So Beis Hillel says, if you convert and have bris milah on Erev Pesach, that's like your tamei tumas meis, 7-day tumah. Beis Shammai says, no, if you convert an Erev Pesach, all you need to do is go to the mikvah, and you can eat Karban Pesach that night. So also let's analyze. Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Machlokes ba'aral nochri. The machlokes Rabbosai is when a non-Jew is converting. The Beis Hillel Savri, listen to this Rabbosai. So why does let's analyze this for just a moment. So Joe the guy is converting, right? So he goes in and he converts on Erev Pesach. Now he becomes a Jew. So Beis Hillel says that a porish mina arla, removal of the foreskin, removal of the arla, is like coming in contact with a mace, which means now that the ger is now going to be tamei for 7 days. Where does that come from? Right? What is that? What is it? From where do we ever see that somehow bris milah is the equivalent of tumas mace? So we'll say, now watch this. Says the Gemara, it's a gzeira. The Beis Hillel Savri gzeira shema yitma l'shana haba. So we'll say, what is Beis Hillel concerned about? Beis Hillel is concerned about the following situation. That maybe next year, now remember, by next year already, the Gentile is a full-fledged Jew. Right? So Pesach, so let's just our timeline. Erev Pesach 5781 is when Joe the Gentile is converting. Okay? Baruch Hashem, he converts, good. So comes Pesach 5782. Now Joe is Yosef, he's a full-fledged Jew. So what are we concerned about? The Beis Hillel Savri, Gzeira Shema Yitma L'Shana Haba. We're concerned that Yosef the Ger is going to become Tamei next year. V'yomer, Ishtakid Milo Tavalti Va'achalti. Achshav nami et bol va'ochel, v'lo yoda di ishtaki nochri hava, v'lo mekabel tuma. Achshav Yisrael o mekabel tuma. Beis Hillel is concerned with a certain amount of confusion. So Beis Hillel is going to say like this. So this year, Joe the Gentile, when he converted, all he needed to do was he got his bris, he went to the mikvah, not for Gerus, but went to the mikvah before Korban Pesach, and it was good to go. So next year, he's going to say to himself like this, last year, all I needed to eat the Korban Pesach was what? Tvila in a mikvah. This year, even though I became Tamei, all I need is Tvila in a mikvah again. And he won't realize that last year, all he needed was Tvila in a mikvah. Why? Because he was a Gentile. And therefore, in his Gentile state, even if he came in contact with a corpse, halacha l'maisa, a Gentile is not subject to the laws of Tumantara. So all he needed was Tvila, and ultimately he was good to go. Masha'in Kain, again, once he's a Jew, if he comes in contact with Tuma, halacha l'maisa, he might require, if it's corpse Tuma, 7 days. Therefore, Beis Hillel holds, I will say, that halacha l'maisa, in order to avoid confusion, any time that a Nachri converts on Erev Pesach, we are going to impose upon him a 7-day Tumah. That way he becomes sensitive to halachos of Tuman Tara and knows that next year, should he become Tamei, he'll recognize that he can't just go to the mikvah and Korban Pesach, but rather, again, there is a real Tara process. However, Aval Orel Yisrael, Devrei Akol Tovel Va'ocheles Pischol La'erev, Below Gazvinon Ari Yisrael Mishum Aral Nachri. But I will say, but Beis Hillel will say, this is only true by a person who's circumcising Atzgerus. But let's say you have a Jew who is just uncircumcised for whatever the reason, and does his circumcision, does his bris milah on Erev Pesach. Even Beis Hillel would agree in that case, all he needs to do is go to the mikvah, and you're good to go. So we'll say, so Beis Hillel's concern is that with the person who converts on Erev Pesach, and we say, if you tell him all you need to do is go to the mikvah, and then you can eat Korban Pesach, he's going to think that in general, all you need to do in order to go ahead and eat Korban Pesach, even if you're in a state of Tumah, is to go ahead and what? Go to the mikvah. So we'll say, so just to illustrate where this case comes up, let's say in this case with the Ger, before he converted, that day Erev Pesach, he went to a levaya, he went to a funeral on Erev Pesach morning, and then what happens? Now he goes there and he converts, he goes to the mikvah Korban Pesach, he's going to say, now comes next year, he goes to a levaya again on Erev Pesach. So he's going to say to himself, you know what, last year I went to the levaya on Erev Pesach, and all I needed to do in order to eat Korban Pesach was what? Go to the mikvah. So this year, all I need to do is go to the mikvah and I can eat Korban Pesach as well. And he's not going to realize that what's the distinction. Last year, when he went to the levaya, what was his status? He was a nachri. He was a Gentile. So therefore, again, there's no tumantara. So when he went to the mikvah, that was enough. This year he's a Jew. And as a Jew, he is subject to the laws of Tumantara, and going to the mikvah for a Tumas Meis exposure is not enough. So therefore, Beis Hillel says, just in order to avoid any level of confusion, we're just going to say that when a non-Jew converts on Erev Pesach, there's an automatic 7-day tumah upon him, just to make it uniform. Now, of course, that'll cause him to lose out on Erev Pesach this year, but it's better that way than to avoid confusion in the past. However, of course, this halacha only applies to a non-Jew who is circumcising Al's conversion. But Lamaisa, if you have an uncircumcised Jew who does bris milah on Erev Pesach, everyone will agree that all he has to do is go to the mikvah and he can eat Karban Pesach. So the Gemara Satan Nachir Brayso that supports this. Amar Reb Shimon Elazar lo nechluku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel al Arei Yisrael shetov halacha pischo. Beis Shammai Beis Hillel do not disagree regarding a situation ultimately again of a Jew who does milah on Erev Pesach, that all he needs to do is go to the mikvah and he can eat his Pesach. Haman nechalku. What do they argue about? Al oral nochri. All they argue about a non-Jew. Shebei Shammai omrim tova va'ochel es pischol erev. Beis Shammai says he could go ahead and just eat his Karban Pesach that night. Ubeis Hillel omrim aporish mina arla ke porish mina kever. And Beis Hillel says, no, one who goes out, literally one who separates from his arla, one who gets a bris milah on Erev Pesach, is like one who came in contact with a corpse, and therefore Allah Lamaisa has to observe 7 days of Tara. So both say, so this is actually very, so how do we pass in this halacha? So the Rambam here, in Parak Vav, halacha Zayin, writes as follows. So the Rambam says, Yisrael Orel Shemal be'erev Pesach, if a Jew did bris milah on Erev Pesach, shochten alav achar shemal. So the halacha is, you can go ahead, he could eat that night. Aval gershin iskayer b'yom arba'asar, umal v'taval, ein shochten alav, shena ochal le'erev, v'haryu kiporish min hakever, shetzarech shiva yomim v'achar kach yitar. Gzeira shema yitma gerzet. So we'll say so again. So halacha l'maisa, the Rambam goes on and explains that essentially he passed like Beis Hillel. This is actually quite fascinating. So if you have a non-Jew who converts on Erev Pesach, we would not allow him to eat Karban Pesach that night. So we'll say why? Because again, out of concern that now the ger will think all you need to do to remedy tumah for Karban Pesach purposes is tvila in a mikvah, and whereas tvila in a mikvah works for certain types of tumah, it will not work for tumas mei. So in order to avoid any kind of confusion, if he converts on Erev Pesach, essentially we go ahead and impose upon him a 7-day tumah. So we'll say, again, the Rambam goes on, but quite a fascinating halacha. So we pass him like Beis Hillel. So the Gemara goes weiter. So we'll say, this brings up an interesting discussion. Amar Rava. So Rava says, Orel hazoa v'zema. So we'll say the case of Orel, which is the case we just mentioned, Hazoa, the case of sprinkling of the ashes of the paraduma, and izema, which is the knife from milah, he'amidu divreim b'makom kares. So both say, what the Gemara is going to point out now is quite a fascinating dynamic. You know, sometimes, so you see over here, that Chazal keep their gezeras in place, and sometimes they lift them, right? So isn't it interesting? We just spoke about before, for example, in Onain. Right, in Onain, so we just said midda oraisa, on the day of death, a person has a biblical status of aninos. And Chazal extended that status into the night. So for example, Reuven loses his father on Sunday day. So halacha l'maisa, he's in Onain that day. Technically speaking, that night there's no more aninos, which means he should be able to eat karbanos. Yet, midrabanon, we extend his aninos into Sunday night, and he can't eat karbanos. But if Reuven loses his father on Erev Pesach, the status of Aninos is on Erev Pesach, but yet that night, we will suspend his rabbinic Aninos so that he has the ability to eat the Karban Pesach. So you see, sometimes Chazal suspend their halachas, yet we just saw in the case of the ger who converts on Erev Pesach, that's what? Chazal goes there to say he's tameh at night, and therefore he can't eat Karban Pesach. So now Rav is coming along and saying it's interesting. Sometimes Chazal keep their gzeros in place, sometimes they lift their gzeros. So for example, Orel hazoi zemel, in the case of Orel, sprinkling of the ashes of paraduma, and milah knife, hamidu divreim. Chazal kept their halachas in place. Again, we'll discuss each of these cases. So the Gemara says, hamidu divreim b'makom kares. Chazal went ahead and kept their halachas in place, even in a situation where ultimately there is kares. We'll define what that means in just a moment. Onain mitzora ubeis hapras, but in the case of onain, mitzora and beis hapras, we'll discuss all these cases as well. Halacha l'maisa lo hamidu divrei makom kares. Chazal suspended their halachas. when there was a situation of kares. So we'll say, what does this mean? Let's go through the cases. So Arel, Hada Amr. So we'll say, Arel, that's the case we just mentioned, right? What's the halacha of Arel? Namely, again, that if a non-Jew converts on Erev Pesach, we essentially go ahead and impose upon him a 7-day tumah. But we'll say, even though what? Even though now, as a result of that rabbinic 7-day tumah, he will not be able to do Karban Pesach. And obviously, Karban Pesach is very severe because halacha l'maisa, failure to do Karban Pesach intentionally results in kares. Yet Chazal, now obviously the ger is not going to be slapped with kares because Chazal are preventing him from doing the mitzvah. But you see over that Chazal keep their halacha, even though their halacha will prevent the ger from doing Karban Pesach. Arel, what's the case? Arel Da'amrin. Hazal, what's the case of Hazal? Da'amr Mar, Hazal Shabbos. This is very interesting. What's the case of Hazah? So both sides, remember, a person who contracts corpse tumah is sprinkled with the ashes of para aduma on day 3 and day 7 of their 7-day purification process. And both say, let's say, for example, day 7 comes out on Shabbos. On Shabbos, both say, so let's say, for example, and let's say that Shabbos is Erev Pesach. So remember, if you sprinkle the guy who's tameh with the ashes of the paraduma and the water on Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach, he'll be able to eat Karban Pesach that night. But failure to do so will preclude him from eating Karban Pesach. So, what's the halacha? We do not sprinkle the ashes of paraduma on an individual on Shabbos. Why not? Because Chazal said you can't do it because it has the appearance, ultimately, again, of tikkun, of fixing something. Right? Remember again, when you sprinkle someone with ashes of paraduma, you're fixing their status. Well, fixing looks like a malacha. It's doma malacha. It's a shvus. It's a derabanan. Therefore, we don't sprinkle ashes. So, what do you see from here? So you see the Chazal are maintaining their halacha in place, even though by not sprinkling the guy with the ashes of the paraduma, you're going to prevent him from offering up Karban Pesach. So Hazah shvus in the Shabbos izemo. What's the case of the Mila knife? Tisanyo, Keshem Shein Mevin, also Derech Rosh Hashanah. So both say, now remember again, halacha l'maisa, you are allowed to do a bris milah on Shabbos. Even though, again, performing bris milah entails malacha, namely the drawing of blood, and drawing of blood is the malacha of shechita, we say milah bizmana is docha Shabbos. You are right. The pasuk says in Parashas Tazria, "Ubayom hashmini yimal basar Allah." So on the 8th day you do milah. In the Meradashins, bayom hashmini afilu b'Shabbos. But listen to this. What about carrying the knife? Let's say the Moel forgot to bring the knife to the shul before Shabbos, or to the house before Shabbos. So we'll say, what's the halacha? The Brisa says, "Kishem shein mevin also derech Rosh Hashanah." The same way that you can't carry a knife through Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos. They're both saying that I understand. I understand they can't carry a knife. Why? Because carrying a knife in Rosh Hashanah will be what? Will be what? Amalacha d'oraisa. But not only that, kach in mevin also derech gagos, v'derech chatzeros, v'derech karfifos. So both say, remember again, we remember from our Masechah Shabbos days, that remember, there is a way to carry an item without transgressing any biblical law. Right? Essentially carry it through a series of rishuyos hayachid. Right? Carry through a series of public domains. Rooftops, chatzeros, right? Karfeifs. So there's plenty of ways to carry something, to transport an item from point A to point B without transgressing anything biblically. Yet, halacha l'maisa, you're not allowed to do it. So we'll say, see from here. So all the Gemara is just pointing out is that halacha l'maisa, there are cases where Chazal will keep their gezeros intact, even though, again, the keeping those gezeros intact will prevent one from performing significant mitzvos. Yet there are other times when Chazal lifted their halachas or suspended their halachas in order to allow for the performance of a mitzvah. So the first three, so Arel Hazah Izemel, right, are three cases where Chazal kept their halachas intact. Onein Mitzora Beis HaPras is where Chazal lifted their halachas or suspended their gzerus in order to allow for the performance of mitzvahs. Let's go through this case. Onein Hadam. So we'll say Onein we spoke about, right? What's the case of Onein? That even though midrabanan we extend aninos into the nighttime, nevertheless halacha l'maisa for Karban Pesach purposes we suspend aninos so that the Onein could partake of Karban Pesach that night. Mitzora mahir. We'll say this is fascinating. What's the case of Mitzora? Listen to this case. Mitzora shechal shmini shlo be'erev Pesach. So we'll say, now watch this case. We've got a guy who's a Mitzora. Right? He's gone through his purification process and he's up to day 8. Now day 8 would be the day that he would normally come to the Beis HaMikdash in order to get the blood applications, right, on his on the various parts of his body in order to finish up his Tara process. So now we have a day 8 Mitzora. Okay, so he's ready for his the final piece of his purification process, and the 8th day also happens to be Erev Pesach. So the great news is that now this Mitzora, once he finishes his purification process, he's going to be able to eat Karan Pesach that night. Fantastic news. But what happened? V'ra keri bo bayom. Now we'll say what happens on day 8. He has a seminal emission. He becomes a Baal Keri. Now we'll say, now why is this problematic? This is problematic because remember, in order for him to have his purification for the Mitzora process, he has to come into the Beis HaMikdash compound. He has to come into Har HaBayis. The problem is a Baal Keri can't come onto Har HaBayis. Right? Baal Keri can't come into Machane Leviyah. So what do we do in a case like this? Now the problem is that in order that means now not only that means is that the Mitzora is not going to have his purification, which means he won't be able to eat Korban Pesach. So watch what we do. So the Gemara says, Mitzora shechal shmini shel be'erev Pesach v'ra keri bo bayom tovel va'ochel. We allow him to go to the mikvah and eat Korban Pesach that night. Amru chachamim afa pisha tvul yom eino nichnas. And the chacham said, even though halacha l'maisa normally we do not allow a tvul yom. We'll say, so remember again, what we tell the Mitzora is, fine, you had a seminal emission that day, go to the mikvah, and now go to the Beis HaMikdash in order to go ahead and get your blood applications. Even though we say, normally halacha l'maisa, a tvul yom can't come to the Beis HaMikdash, mutav yavo aseh sheyesh bo kares, v'yitcha aseh she'ein bo kares. Interesting enough, the Gemara says, we're going to tell the Mitzora, go to the mikvah for your keri emission, and now go to the Beis HaMikdash. And even though by going to the Beis HaMikdash and the status of a tvul yom, you are in violation of an aseh, we would rather have you be in violation of an aseh that doesn't have kares, so that you could eat the Korban Pesach that night, which is an aseh which carries with it a penalty of kares. The Rabbos and I watch this. Rabbi Yochanan, Dvar Torah afilu asein bo. The truth is, the prohibition for a Baal Keri to come into the Beis HaMikdash. Remember, a Baal Keri was a Tvul Yom, which means he had a seminal emission, he went to the mikvah, he just needs Erev Shemesh. That's not even an Isra D'Oraisa, or an Aseh D'Oraisa. Shnei Amar, Vayavo Yehoshaphat Bekal Yehuda, V'Yushalayim B'Beis Hashem L'fnei Chatzar HaChadasha. That Yehoshaphat stood in the Chatzar HaChadasha. My Chatzar HaChadasha, Shechidshu Bo Davar. It was the Chatzar where they made a new ruling, V'Amru Tvul Yom Lo Yikanis B'Machane Leviyah. And they legislated that a Tvul Yom, also remember again, who's a Tvul Yom? A Tvul Yom was a person who went to the mikvah already for his Tumah, and all he needs is Erev Shemesh, all he needs is sunset. Yehoshaphat instituted that such a person should not come to Machane Leviyah. Remember, both say, Machane Leviyah is the Har HaBayis, the Beis HaMikdash. So ultimately, Yehoshaphat legislated this, they shouldn't come. So what do you see from here? It's not even a D'Oraisa that the Tvul Yom can come to the Beis HaMikdash, but rather, again, it's a D'Rabbanan. So we'll say, now watch this. So listen, this is a little bit more of a complicated case. So here's an example of a Din D'Rabbanan which was suspended in order to facilitate Korban Pesach consumption. So we'll say, what's the case? A very, very specific case. A Mitzora, who has gone through his entire 7-day purification process. Now it's day number 8. Day number 8 is the day where he shows up ultimately again to go and get his blood application. I both say, and I know what you're thinking. Well, one second, forget about Baal Keri. How can a Mitzora himself come to the Beis HaMikdash? Because most remember again, a Mitzora is not allowed to come into all 3 machanos, Machane Shechina, Machane Leviyah, Machane Yisrael. So remember again, after he's undergone his 7 days of purification, he could come into Machane Yisrael. And remember, Rashi points out, we're not going to do it inside, but Rashi points out, he stands by Shar Nikanor. Shar Nikanor was the eastern gate, and of course we just had this a few days ago. the width of that gate was not sanctified. So he stands in the width of that gate, which is not sanctified with Kedushas HaMikdash. The Kohen comes to him and does the blood applications. Fine. This Metzora case is very specific, because what happens? He's now going through a 7-day purification process. It's day 8. He's able to show up in the Beis HaMikdash to get his blood applications and then be done with his saras. Great news. Day 8 for him is also Erev Pesach. Fantastic. So then he's going to have his Korban Pesach. What happens? Day number 8, Erev Pesach, he becomes a Balkari. Under normal circumstances. What's the status of a Balkari? We say go to the mikvah, but you can't come to the mikdash until when? Until when? That night. That night, you have Harav Shemesh. So we'll say it turns out that din, that a Balkari cannot come into Machan Leviyah, is a din dirabanan. And when it turns out that the Keri status is preventing an 8th day Metzora from completing his purification process, we will suspend that din dirabanan so that the Metzora could show up, get his blood application, become tahar, and ultimately again eat Korban Pesach that night. So another example, so we'll say again, we're just contrasting categories. Sometimes Chazal say our legislation remains in place, even though that will preclude you from eating the Korban Pesach, and other times they lift it. Last case, Beis HaPras, we'll say last line, Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. Incredible. Beis HaPras, we'll say, so we know the case of Beis HaPras. Beis HaPras is a field in which we know for sure there was a grave. But what happened? The field was plowed over, and now the location of the grave is unknown. So the status, of course, so what happens if you go through a Beis HaPras? So watch this. This now Beis HaPras, this now B'Shavin, Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that what? Amud Beis. Shebotkin la'osei Pesach, vein botkin la'ochlei Truma. Both say this is a great case. So we'll say that Halacha says follows. If a person needs to cross that field in order to go ahead and do their Korban Pesach, botkin, we allow the person to traverse that field in order to go ahead and eat his Korban Pesach. We'll discuss what this means in just a moment. However, halacha l'maisa, if you need to cross that field to eat your truma, we'll say what it means is we allow a person to essentially traverse that field through checking the field in order to be able to eat his Korban Pesach. But we will not allow the individual to go through that field, to traverse that field in order to eat truma. So what does that mean? For truma, we say find a different way around. Find a different way around. And if you choose to go through that field, we're going to levy upon you at least the rabbinic level of tuma. So my bodkin lo Pesach, we'll say, what does that mean? That a person could cross that field in order to do Korban Pesach, but you have to check the field. What does that mean? What it means, we'll say, is it's a little bit tedious, but what you have to do is you walk and you blow on the dirt in front of you each step you take. Why do you blow on the dirt in front of you? Because this way, if there's any bone fragment there, if you blow on the earth, you could scatter the dust. You'll see if there's bone. So it takes a little while to get across the field, but lamaisa, there's a way to do it. So we'll say what it means is, for Korban Pesach, we will allow you to navigate the Beis HaPras if that's the best way for you to get to your Korban Pesach. But let's say for Truma, for other Kodshim, we'll tell you find a different route. And if you choose to go through the Beis HaPras, you will be rabbinically tummy. Rabbi Yehuda bar Abaye Mishmeid Rabbi Yehuda Amar Beis HaPras Sheni Yoshtar. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rabbi Yehuda bar Abaye says that what in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. Beis HaPras Sheni Yosh. The Rabbi say Halacha if you have a Beis HaPras that has had an incredible amount of pedestrian traffic, such a Beis HaPras is tahar. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, since there are so many people who ultimately went ahead and walked through it, we assume that any bone fragments have been totally scattered out of the normative path, and therefore halacha l'maisa, one would be permitted to go ahead and walk through it while still maintaining tahara. So therefore, we'll say, we see in really, really incredible cases, we see that there are 3 instances where Chazal said our legislation will remain in place, even though, again, halacha l'maisa, that legislation will prevent me from eating Korban Pesach, and 3 other cases where Chazal chose to suspend their legislation in order to facilitate Korban Pesach participation. Incredible. Hadron halachic Shabbos. Obviously, there's a lot more written about why Chazal choose to keep their halachas intact in certain circumstances, but choose in other times to suspend their halachas, but that's part of a bigger discussion. Hadron halachic Shabbos. Mazel tov. Mazel tov. Mazel tov. Incredible. Incredible. Weiter. So we'll say now we're going to get into the halachas of Pesach Sheni. So remember again, The Torah, when it speaks about Pesach Sheni, speaks about a person who was Tamei or B'derech Rechoka, someone who was unable to go ahead and someone who was unable to offer a Pesach Rishon, either because he was ritually impure or he was just too far away. So Misha Hayat Tamei or B'derech Rechoka v'lo asa es harishon, someone who was Tamei or too far away. We'll have to define what too far away means, and therefore did not perform Pesach Rishon. Yaseh es hasheni. Ultimately, again, could go and fulfill his obligation with Pesach Sheni. Shagag o ne'enas v'lo asa es harishon. Similarly, if a person was shogeg, inadvertently failed to perform Pesach Rishon, or ne'enas, there was an extenuating circumstance which prevented him from offering a Pesach Rishon, v'lo asa Rishon, yaseh es hasheni. So I will say, so really what the Mishnah is saying is like this. Pretty much, any case of shogeg or ones, any case where just for some reason accidentally you didn't perform Pesach Rishon, or ones, there was an extenuating circumstance, you have the ability to utilize Pesach Sheni. Well, if that's the case, imkain, lama ne'amar tamei or b'derech rechoka. So we'll say, if that's the case, why don't you just be a bit more explicit? Why not just say, if you are an ones or a shogeg, you get to utilize Pesach Sheni? Why does the Torah have to say tamei or derech rechoka? She'elu p'tur meikares ve'elu chayavim meikares. What it means is these are patur from kares, i.e., tamei and derech rechoka, but others are chayiv in kares. So we'll say Rashi points out, the Gemara will have to define what exactly that phrase means. So we'll say, let's analyze. Itmar. So we'll say, now we come to a very interesting. So we'll say, now this is the sugya Pesach Sheni. Say, Itmar, listen to this interesting Gemara. We'll say, what about the following situation? Let's say I am b'derech rechoka, right? So I'm too far away, so to speak. And what happens? So we'll say, which means that right now, where I am geographically, it is impossible for me to get to Yerushalayim in time to do the shechita for the Pesach. Impossible. But, listen to this, halacha l'maisa, it's possible for me to get there Pesach night in order to eat the karban. Right? So I'm in a place geographically where I'm too far away to get there in time for shechita / zrika, but I can get there for consumption. But the rest of the members of my mishpacha are there, and they're more than happy to shecht on my behalf. What's the halacha in such a situation? Look at Rashi. Shachtu v'zarko alav. It's the first Rashi in the Gemara section Rashi, right across in Tosas mi. Shachtu v'zarko alav ule erev yavo. So I can't get there by day, but I can get there at night. Umikol makam b'derech rechokahu she'enu yachal likanis b'shah shchita dahainu kol sheishos ashkes achama. So we'll say right now I'm in a. So remember the case of derech rechoka means that's supposed to say the case of derech rechoka means I can't get there in time to shech the karban Pesach. So I can't get there before shkia, before sunset of erev Pesach, but I can get there sometime on Pesach night in order to actually consume the Karban Pesach. So we'll say, here's the Shaila. My Chabura, my family, is in Yerushalayim. I'm too far. I won't get there before Yom Tov starts, but I can get there by Seder night. If they shecht on my behalf, including me, I'll show up, I'll be there in time for consumption, but cannot be there in time for Shechita. Does that work? Does that work? Can I be part of their Chabura for Pesach Rishon? Or do we say that because there is no way for me to get there during the time of Shechita, by definition what? I'm pushed to Pesach Sheni. That's the Shaila. So Rav Nachman Amar Hurtza, Rav Nachman says it works. It works. And halacha l'maisa, I'm part of min hasheni. It works. Halacha l'maisa, it's no problem. I'm part of the chabur of Pesach Rishon. I'm yotzei. Rav Sheshes Amar Lo Hurtza. Rav Sheshes says it does not work. Let's analyze. The Gemara says, look, Rav Nachman Amar Hurtza, meichas hu dechas rachamana alav. The Abid Tava Alav Bracha. Because also, listen to this, Rav Nachman says it works. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, when the Torah gives me the right of Pesach Sheni, the Torah is telling me if I'm too far away and I can't make it, the Torah is giving me an option ultimately, again, for a make-up date. But if I can make it, if there's some way for me to eat Pesach Rishon, even though I can't get to Yerushalayim ultimately during the Zman Shechita, but I'm going to make it there that night, so that's obviously preferable. Rav Sheshes Amar Lo Hortza, Mitcha dachye rachmane kitame. So we'll say Rav Nachman says, Rav Sheshes says it does not work. Why? Because we'll say the Torah equates derech rechoka with tame. Just like a person who's tame is precluded from participating in Pesach Rishon, so too if I am too far away, I'm just too far away, and I can't make it to Yerushalayim in the time of Shechita, I am nidcha. I'm nidcha. I'm simply set aside. I'm out of the window, and I'm out of the parsha, and therefore, by definition, I am pushed to Pesach Sheni. What's a fascinating machlokes? I'm Rav Nachman, so let's analyze more. So Rav Nachman says, "Mina minallah." From where do I know that even if someone is b'derech rechoka during the Zman Shechita, but can make it to Yerushalayim by Pesach night, and his chabura shechts on his behalf, that is Yotzei Pesach Rishon? I'll tell you from where. So from where do I know? This nan mishaya b'tamei or b'derech rechoka v'lo asas harishon ya'asas hasheni. If someone was tamei or derech rechoka and therefore did not participate in Pesach Rishon, he can go ahead and do Pesach Sheni michlal di boy of it. Now, both say, interestingly enough, Rav Nachman says, just look at the wording of the Mishnah. The wording of the Mishnah seems to indicate to us if somebody was tamei or derech choka v'lo asas harishon and did not do, meaning because he was too far away, he did not perform Pesach Rishon. Rav Nachman says implicit in those words is if somehow there was the ability for him to perform Pesach Rishon and he did so, he would be Yotzei. What's the possibility for him to perform Pesach Rishon if he's too far away? If the rest of the members of my Chabura were in Yerushalayim, they had me in mind. They included me as part of the Chabura. They had me in mind at the time of the Shechita. When I make it there again for Pesach night, I'm Yotzei. For Rav Sheshes, Amar L'cha, Rav Sheshes will say that can't be the proper reading, because I'll tell you why. Ihachi, if that's the case, Seifa, look at the end of the Mishnah. Diktani, Shagag od ne'enas v'lo asas harishon yasas hasheni. The Mishnah said, right, that if a person was shogeg or ones and did not perform Pesach Rishon, you can perform Pesach Sheni. Now, midiktani v'lo asa, I will say that fact that it says v'lo asa, he did not do so, mechlal di'i boy ovid. So I'll say, what are you going to infer from that? So, in other words, Rav Sheshes says to Rav Nachman, you're saying that the lashon of v'lo asa, he did not do, indicates to us, but if he found a way to do it, he would be Yotzei. Well, how does that lashon make sense with the cases of shogeg or ones? Mechlal di boy of it. How can you say that? Hare shagag v'hare ne'anas. We'll say, obviously, if he's shogeg or he's ones, that means there was no friend to do it. Ella, we'll say, watch this. It's actually pretty wild. Ella mezid katoni bahadayu. Rather, I'll say, it must be that each part of the Mishnah, the Reisha and the Seifa, had two stated cases and one unstated case. The case ultimately, again, of the unstated case of the Seifa, ultimately, again, was Mezid. The Rabbi say, Allah Lamaisa again is made, right? Hachanami onin katoni bahadayu. So maybe ultimately, again, in the first case, the unstated case ultimately was onin. And the second, in the Seifa, the unstated case was Mezid. Rabbi say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Mezid katoni bahadayu, va'ala kai v'lo asa, di'i boy avid. So we'll say in the Seifa, the unstated case was Mezid. And that refers to a case where he could have done it, but chose not to do it. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Sheshes, mas nisin nami deka. Our Mishnah seems to support this reading as well. Diktani, elu peturin mehikares, ve'elu chayavin beikares. Because remember, we'll say that cryptic last line of the Mishnah, when it said, these are pater from kares, but ultimately, again, these will be chayiv in kares. Ahaya, what is that referring to? Ilema ashogeg v'ne'anas, shogeg v'ne'anas b'nei kares ninu. So we'll say, can't refer to shogeg and ne'anas, because a shogeg and ne'anas subject to kares. Elalav amazid va'onin. Rather, it must refer ultimately again to mazid and onin. Because most remember again, like we saw before, if somebody doesn't perform Korban Pesach b'mazid, the penalty for that is kares. Similarly, Rabbi say onin. This goes back to last parak. What's the halacha by onin? Rabbi say, what's the halacha by onin? An onin midrabanan is precluded at night. But remember, by Korban Pesach, what did Chazal do with their gzera about onin? What did they do? They lifted it. That was just Mamish last Gemara. They suspended their halachas. Therefore, if an onain does not perform Korban Pesach by night, he is chayiv kares. Rav Nachman Amar L'chali Olam Amezid L'chudei. Rav Nachman disagrees. He says no. In reality, this refers to Mezid by himself. Ubedinhu di'ibayle lemisna chayiv, and really you should have said chayiv. V'haidik tani chayavin. So should have just said chayiv in the singular. Why does it say chayiv in the plural? Aidi de tana reisha pturin tana nami seifa chayavin. Since it said by the reisha pater, so to it said. Since it said by the reisha pturin plural, so to it said by the seifa chayavin plural as well. Even though Rav Nachman will say that halacha l'mais is only really one case of chiyuv kares, i.e. the case of mezid. So we'll say fine. So Amr Sheshis, Minamena. So Rav Sheshis, where do I know my shita from? So we'll say, remember again, we're remaining laser focused over here. We're talking about a very specific case, derech rechoka. But in this case of derech rechoka, I am geographically too far away to make it to Yerushalayim, ultimately again, during the time of Shechita. But when can I make it to Yerushalayim for? When? At night for Achila. So the Shaila is now, if my mishpacha is in Yerushalayim, can they have me in mind to be part of the Chabura? Even though, again, I can't make it in time for Shechita, but can make it in time ultimately again at night to eat. So remember again, Rav Nachman says it works. It works. I'm part of the Chabura. I don't have to do Pesach Sheni. Rav Shesha says it does not work. So it says Rav Shesha, Amar Rav Shesha mina aminallah. So Rav Shesha says, from where do I know that halacha l'maisa does not work? Low word. So listen to this. Tisanya, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ne'amar Tameh v'ne'amar b'derech rechoka. It says Tameh and it says b'derech rechoka. Right, verse of the Torah lumps these two things together. Top of Tzadik Gimel. Ma Tameh shesipik biyado lasos ve'ino oseh. So both say, technically speaking, a person who's Tameh, does he have the physical wherewithal, the physical ability to perform the karban? And the answer is yes. What's preventing him from performing the karban? What's preventing him? His status. So technically speaking, he has the physical ability to do so, but he can't do it because of his status. Af derech rechoka so to Rabbi said, the case of derech rechoka ultimately again could be a case where what? Where Allah Chalamaisa, he has the ability to do so. Where does he have the ability to perform the Karban Pesach if he's b'derech rechoka? So how could that happen? That's our case. Where my mishpacha is in Yerushalayim, they could shecht on my behalf, and I could get there at night on time to go ahead and shecht. So we'll say, so remember, but yet what? It will not work. So we'll say, so again, this is Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes is the one who says this case does not work, and Rav Sheshes, it doesn't work based on the idea, the fact that the Torah equates Tameh and Derech Rechoka. Just like Tameh is a person who has the physical wherewithal to offer up the karban, but his status prevents him from doing so. So to derech rechoka refers to even someone who is too far away bisman shchita, but has mishpacha who could shecht on his behalf, make him part of the chabura, and he'll get there in time to eat that night. But yet, halacha l'maisa, the Torah prevents him from doing so. If you can't make it there bisman shchita, that is called derech rechoka, and you are pushed to Pesach Sheni. Rav Nachman, so Rabbi says that this is Rav Shesh's shita. So Shesh Rabbi understands. This is why the Torah, this is based on Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva's drasha. Tameh and derech rechoka are in the same boat. And just as Tameh has the physical wherewithal to perform the karban, but his status prevents him, so too, even if you're b'derech rechoka and you have the physical wherewithal. What's the case of physical wherewithal? Where the other members of your chabura are in Yerushalayim, bisman shchita. They could shecht on your behalf, include you as part of the chabura, and you'll make it there in time for nighttime. That's still called derech rechoka, and you are pushed to Pesach Sheni. I would Rav Nachman say this. Rav Nachman Amar L'cha, that's not a good raya, because you're quoting Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva generally holds, Rabbi Akiva, the Tamei Tekasavar, Ein Shochtin V'Zarkin Al Tamei Sheretz. V'Ana Sfiru Lekimandam Ar Shochtin V'Zarkin Al Tamei Sheretz. Because I'll say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Akiva has a more chamerdik approach. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi say, holds that if someone is Tamei Tumas Sheretz on Erev Pesach, you cannot include them as part of the Chabura. Even though what Rabbi say, what's the status of Tumas Sheretz? Right? How does Tumas Sheretz work? Tumas Sheretz, right? All you need is to go to the mikveh that day, and that night you are mutter. But said everyone else holds that if a person is tamei with Tumas Sheretz on Erev Pesach, so even though technically speaking he can't eat to the karban now, but we know he could eat to the karban that night. Everyone else holds he can be part of the chabura, because even though he's precluded now, all he needs to go is the mikvah by day, and at night he'll be fit. Rabbi Akiva holds that someone who's coming to Masheretz can't be part of the chabura. So Rabbi Akiva is more machmir in general about these things. Apparently Rabbi Akiva holds that in order to really be part of a chabura for Karban Pesach, what has to happen? You have to be 100% fit and present at the Zman Shchita. V'haraya, even someone who's tummy to Masheretz, according to Rabbi Akiva, can't be part of a chabura. And Rav Nachman will say, we don't paskin that way. We don't paskin that way. We paskin that even if you can't be present Bizman Shchita, but we know for sure you're going to be good to go that night, that's good enough. So someone who's coming to Masharis can go to the mikvah by day, participate as part of the chabura at night. Similarly, Rav Nachman will say, someone who was bederech recholka on Erev Pesach, but can make it to Yerushalayim ultimately again by night, ultimately can be included as part of the chabura. So I will say, so we end off with this yesodistic fundamental machlokes. So remember, kind of like the paradigmatic case of derech recholka is what? Where you're just too far away. You can't make it to Yerushalayim at all, at any time, even by the night of Pesach. That's the paradigmatic case of derech recholka. The machlokes case is, I'm far away enough that I can't make it to Yerushalayim ultimately when? On Erev Pesach, Bizman Shchita. But what if I can make it by the night of the Seder? Can I be included as part of a chabura or not? That is the machlokes. Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes. Rav Nachman saying that works. You're part of the chabura. You're Yotzei at Pesach Rishon. Rav Sheshes saying it does not work. You're not part of the chabura. You're pushed to Pesach Sheni. Both say we will see the halacha lemaisa who we paskin like Emir Hashem tomorrow. All right, Chevron Zoom. Everyone have a wonderful day. Yeshakayach, everyone.